Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another Friday at the Humanities Forum. My name is Ian Bernhoft. I'm the coordinator of the Humanities Forum, which is an initiative of the Humanities Program offering you, the Providence College community, the opportunity to learn from leading scholars, professionals, and journalists from around the country and around the world, to engage in the intellectual life outside of class, although a lot of you were in this very room earlier today in class, but now you're out of it, to explore diverse perspectives and to deepen your appreciation for the humanities. Real quick, let me run down the format of what to expect. We're going to begin with our talk, as one does, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end, which we bring to a close at 4:45. At which point, there's a really nice reception right down the hall in the great room. There's always a plenitude of tasty morsels, which is way better than whatever you're going to get at Raymond Dining Hall tonight. So you should come down there and finish the conversation there. A few things you need to do. One, those screens you have, put them away. Yep. Now close them down. You don't need them for notes. You can take notes with your hand. With your just try to remember things with your mind. It's going to be on YouTube next week. If you feel like there's something you have to see again, we got you covered. Secondly, we always want a student to ask the first question. So be thinking as you're listening, be actively listening and formulating a question that you can pop us with. And make sure that during the Q&A, make sure the microphone reaches you, and then you stand up. You don't have to stand up. You do identify who you are and what's your major, and then ask your wonderful question. And then, like I said, come down the hall. Now, moving towards what's going to happen before we go down the hall. You know, in my introductory spiels, one of the things I usually say is these talks give us a chance to ask the big questions. And some of those questions are big because they don't ever actually occur to us in our ordinary day-to-day life. Because something that I think I've noticed about myself, and I think is true about other human beings, is that whatever is the present situation, we tend to take as normal. And the way things are now is the way things always have been, always will be, right? So it's perfectly normal that when we rolled out of bed this morning, the first thing we did was look at a screen which bombarded us with messages from people from all over the world, that we've, at some point today, or certainly by Thanksgiving, we're going to hurtle through space at incredible speeds, probably still looking at the screens with messages from people around the world. And that basically we've filled all our life up with increased velocity, which feels great, and with increased distraction, which also feels great because we might have to stop and think and feel boredom or things like that. And maybe we take that for granted. We don't actually ever ask, well, how is this reshaping ourselves, and what is this turning us into? How is our experience fundamentally different from the experience of the other 10 billion humans who have come before today? So that's what I think we're going to dig into today. Our guest is Dr. Christine Rosen. She's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., where she focuses on American history, society, and culture, and particularly on technology and human behavior. She's a monthly columnist at Commentary Magazine, and she's written in basically all the best places. I won't read you the titles, but her writing has appeared far and wide. She holds a PhD from Emory University in American Intellectual History and is the author of a number of books, including one entitled Preaching Eugenics, Religious Leaders in the American Eugenics Movement, one entitled My Fundamentalist Education, a Memoir of a Divine Girlhood, which was named one of the best nonfiction books of the year by Washington Post, and most recently, The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World. I have this at home. I've been reading it. I think it's good. I was going to bring it and hold it up so you could see it in the flesh and not just on the screen, but I forgot it. So I think she's going to give you a taste of it, though, at her talk today. So the last thing I'll say is that, according to her bio, she holds a third-degree black belt in Aikido and is a martial arts instructor. So if you were thinking about cutting loose in a humanities forum, I would say wait until after Thanksgiving break. Don't mess around here today. She's not somebody to mess with. She is somebody to give a warm round of applause to, however.
Always good to begin a lecture, particularly those of you who are here because you have to fulfill a requirement with a vague threat. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Ian. Well, thank you so much for having me here today and for the invitation to speak to you. I guess I should, everybody usually likes to acknowledge their priors before they talk to a group of college students. And mine is that I'm Gen X, so you'll have to forgive me all the Gen X stereotypes, you know, they're all true. We're bitter but know it all. We're the best generation, but somehow have still failed to achieve any real power. So some of my critique probably comes from that place, for which I apologize in advance. But I want to talk a little bit about technology. I'm sure those of you who've grown up with one of these, spending a lot of time staring at screens, have heard it all. You've heard about many extreme effects of technology: misinformation, disinformation, the mental health crisis that's been sparked by the use of social media, for example, rising rates of depression, anxiety. The Surgeon General had a whole report talking about a loneliness epidemic, much of which he feels technology is implicated in. And all of that is worrisome. And many important people are doing lots of important work about those things. But I think there's something that we're missing when we talk about how technology's transformed our behavior. And that's some of the everyday experiences that we have that might not be as alarming in a newspaper headline, but on a day-to-day basis, and particularly in our personal relationships, have had quite a great impact. So on average, we spend about 7 hours a day staring at screens, 4.5 hours on the smartphone alone. It's higher for you guys, so you can all nod knowingly like, yes, it's only 7 hours. But as Ian alluded to, for most of us, the first thing we touch when we wake up and the last thing we touch before we go to bed is our phone. So what does that mean? Well, I think it means that we have created new habits of mind, new habits of being, new ways of understanding our world as a result of our constant mediation of it. And these are things that make our daily lives now less about an understanding and living in a human condition and more about a user experience. So the title of this book comes from a naturalist named Robert Michael Pyle. And years ago, I read an essay of his. And what he worried about was that an entire generation of American children were not getting out into nature. They weren't mucking around in the forest, they weren't going on hikes, and they weren't engaging with the natural world. And his worry was that by not engaging in the natural world, they wouldn't care at all if something in the natural world disappeared. So if a condor goes extinct, but an entire generation of people has never seen or thought of or looked at a condor, except maybe occasionally on a television nature program, do they even care about the extinction? And so that he talked about things like, you might have heard this phrase, nature deficit disorder, this idea that kids were not getting outside enough, being raised without a lot of hands-on experience. So I would argue that it's been about 20 years since he coined that phrase, extinction of experience. I would say that this challenge of living in the real world with all of our messy physical realities is one we all face now. It's not just a challenge for children, and it's not just about understanding and living in nature. So our experience of pleasure, some of our hands-on skills, a sense of self-reliance, relationships and ability to connect face-to-face with others, these are all threatened by mediating technology, which we use constantly throughout our days. And as the daily intimacy with our physical world recedes, our attachment to digital worlds grows. So more and more we relate to our world through information about it, rather than direct experience with it. So what do I mean by experience? This is the question I started when I first looked at my research, and I really haven't answered it appropriately according to every single person who I discussed this with, because, and this is a challenge for all of us. We used to talk about IRL, right, in real life, and the internet. When the internet was new, we had distinctions, right? We didn't really, we did our lives in the real world, and then we'd send some emails or browse online, and there were clear distinctions. But the real and the digital, really, that distinction has disappeared entirely. Real experiences and their digital equivalents are actually like the difference between eyesight and vision. So eyesight is basically how well our eyes capture what we see. But vision is what allows us to use our eyesight intelligently by directing our perception. And it's more than just functioning eyesight. So I would say in the early years of the internet, we just had this tool. It wasn't all that dramatic a change in how we lived our daily lives. But with the advent of the smartphone and now with wearable technology, I recently tested Meta's new overlaid Ray-Bans with all kinds of stuff on them, and wearable sensors. With all of these new technologies, our technologists are getting more into the vision business. So they're not just enhancing certain human functions. They're moving more rapidly into trying to help us interpret our experiences in real time, not just increase access to it. So that's the difference between putting on a pair of glasses and walking around and seeing the world more clearly, and putting on a pair of glasses with a digital overlay that allows you to maybe not see the homeless person on the street who you don't want to look at, and maybe see only the advertisements that are personally targeted to you. This is the difference here. And we see this in all the advertising for technology. So there was an iPhone advertisement, one of the new editions of the iPhone came out, and it had a much better camera. And this is what the ad copy said. iPhone, a better photographer built in. Instead of teaching people to take better photos, why not teach the camera? And that made me pause, because it says something about our values, right? The technology industry, and Apple in particular, is making some assumptions here. So they equate technology with the person. So it's the camera that becomes the photographer. The photographer used to be the person taking the picture, but in Apple's world, the camera becomes the photographer. And it assumes that the technology is the thing that's more teachable than the human being. And maybe that's correct, but that's also, there's a whole world of assumptions built into that sort of way of seeing the world. I also think these platforms and tools have become our new character-forming institutions. And I say that because they have invaded our private sphere, and including our private worlds, family, home, in ways that are really quite new. I know everybody thinks there's always a moral panic when a new technology comes out, and that's true. But there is something both in terms of scale and reach with these new technologies that is quite new and that has transformed life rapidly. And so the question is whether we want to become what the Apple ad slogan is, live in a world that is automatic, effortless, and seamless. I would argue there are 6 areas where these technologies are threatening deeply rooted, important human experiences, and that we're at a very important moment right now, particularly at the dawn of the era of artificial intelligence, to start really thinking about if we want to continue down the path we've already started down. The first is face-to-face communication. The fact that I'm talking to all of you while being able to look you in the eye is what we're wired as human beings to do. And if you want, the best book on this, in my opinion, is Charles Darwin's Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. He gets a lot wrong because he's writing the 19th century and he didn't know everything. But what he did is go around and try to figure out, what does it mean when someone laughs or reacts? How do we learn to read each other's faces? He had these wonderful experiments where he'd go, sit and watch people in the park, and he describes watching this couple having a conversation, and he's taking notes, and he notices that the woman's eyebrows are starting to rise higher and higher on her face, and he's thinking, ooh, and the guy was continuing to talk and ignore what, her reaction on her face was, and he correctly said, she's getting angry and he's not noticing. And so he'd go around and do all these experiments. But what his instinct was, which I think has been borne out by later research, is that we cannot survive as humans unless we know how to read each other's facial movements and also our embodied movements. So the difference between me going like this and going like this, it's very subtle. I mean, not really that subtle. I was kind of overreacting to show you. But we all instantly know, one, I'm thinking about something, I might be perplexed, and the other, I'm annoyed or I'm angry. Again, we don't know why we know these things, except for most of you, you learn them beginning the moment you were born. When someone held you in their arms, and your vision could only allow you to see as far as your eyes to whoever's holding you's face. And from there, every interaction you had with a fellow human being taught you what those symbols mean. We're replacing those lessons all the time, and at the very youngest stages for very young children, with mediated forms of interaction. And that silent language, which is what anthropologists call all these gestures and unspoken ways we talk, are starting to go unread. And I'll give you a couple of examples, because I know I said 6 things and everyone looked alarmed, so I'll get through them quickly, I promise. Think about how you behave when you go into a store to get something. I'll give you a description of my experience at Starbucks in Union Station when I was taking the train recently. There were some people in line looking bored, looking at their phones. There were a couple people working frenetically behind the counter. But what there mainly was a steady stream of people coming in and picking up their coffee and walking out, because they'd all placed mobile orders. So humanity is flowing in and out of this coffee shop, a classic third place where it's not home, it's not work, and no one was making eye contact, looking at each other, really talking. And that's a missed opportunity. It's a missed opportunity to acknowledge another human being, to give the very hardworking person behind the counter some appreciation from one fellow human being to another. I worked a lot of really terrible retail jobs as a young person, including in a movie theater in high school. And I sort of now look back on it almost with nostalgia, because I had to deal with difficult people who demanded more popcorn that they didn't want to pay for, but they looked me in the eye when they made that demand. Now, if you look at people I interview a lot of people who work in public-facing jobs for this book, and they all shake their head and say, nobody treats me like a human being anymore. So something has shifted in our expectations of how we treat each other and whether or not we think we need to look at each other's faces. If you don't know how to read someone's face, you're not going to be as deeply understanding a human being. And it also might affect your ability to work. I have a friend who works with young diplomats who come into the Foreign Service and are about to go on their first posting. And the main thing she's been concerned about, I'd say in the last 5 years, they don't know how to walk up to a stranger, shake their hand, look them in the eye, and start a general conversation, which is a huge thing if you're going to become a diplomat. So part of the training they're doing now is a kind of remedial social skills stuff, because there's a sense of awkwardness and anxiety and stiffness about walking up to someone and starting a conversation. It is a skill, and it is a useful skill, not just in the workplace, but in everyday life. All right, I'll go through the others quicker, I promise. Second, hands-on knowledge of the world. We all have a memory of the first time we learned how to do something or fix something, I think, right? Something with our hands when we were really little. For my kids, I have 2 boys. Well, they're 18 now, so I guess they're young men. But they were Lego fanatics, so like when they could actually figure out how to do the whole Lego themselves was this great and victorious moment for them. But right now, it's easier physically to send a message from this room to the other side of the world than it is physically to bend down and tie your own shoe. And by the way, a lot of kids don't know how to tie their shoes anymore because they all had Velcro. This is another thing we'll get into. That's kind of a remarkable It's actually an amazing thing that humans figured out how to do that, right? How to send this message. But when we spend a lot of our time in mediated environments, we start to de-skill unmediated physical reality. And the mention of laptops and note-taking is actually quite true, because it comes down to one skill we've almost completely lost, which is handwriting. So people think, I thought this too until I looked at the research, that it's better to sit with your laptop open, taking notes, kind of almost being like a stenographer in lectures while someone's lecturing, and that you'll retain more. In fact, multiple studies now, repeated many times, have found that if you're worried about understanding material and recalling it later, it's much better to write by hand and take notes by hand, because you force your brain to summarize, analyze, and put something down on paper at a rate and in such a way that you're analyzing while you're taking the notes. Whereas when you take notes on a keyboard, you're not doing the same thing. It is a qualitatively different way of trying to commit something to memory than it is if you do it by handwriting. That's because we have something called embodied cognition. Your mind and your body work together, and they teach each other things. So if you remove the hands from the equation and you're just looking with your eyes, swiping, even if you're just swiping on a screen, it's a different, it implicates different regions of the brain. It's kind of fascinating. But the handwriting, for me, became important when I found my kids weren't being taught cursive in school, when they were in elementary school. And I really wanted to make sure I wasn't being an old fogey. I was like, well, it's true. They should learn to keyboard. They have to learn these skills. That's more important. So I started looking at the research. I talked to some neuroscientists and people who work in brain development, and they were all equally horrified about the decline of handwriting. And for them, it was a sort of canary in the coal mine for a lot of these embodied cognitive skills that kids were not having the experience of particularly in schools. And that's because it's not just that it slows down your thinking. So learning to write first in print and then later in cursive is really implicated in future literacy, in the ability to analyze text and organize thoughts, in memory and in recall of what you have read. So our ability to write by hand isn't just about being able to sign our names in legible format. It actually implicates our ability to understand the written word. So there's a number of fascinating studies that reveal this. Here's something a little more straightforward. There are a bunch of bakers who couldn't find anyone to hire to work in their bakeries because they needed people to be able to pipe in frosting "Happy Birthday," and no one could write cursive. They could only do block letters. There are many, many children in this country today who cannot read our founding documents because they were written in cursive. And if you can't write cursive, you can't read it. Talking to a friend just the other day who found an old letter from his mother and gave it to his daughter and said, "Oh, this is the note that your grandmother wrote me the day you were born." She's 13. And she couldn't read it. And this for him was, he's you know, pretty pro-tech guy. He was like, what? So there is a decision we've made as a society to reject this old-fashioned thing in favor of the new. What I would argue is that's just one example of, we rejected the thing very quickly, thinking we were making an improvement by teaching kids keyboarding. But in fact, we've left some important things behind, certainly in terms of cognitive development. Okay, third, patience, which you're all exercising a beautiful amount of while I talk, and I appreciate that. Habits of mind are formed when we do something every day, all day, in the same way. We all know this, right? This is why we're supposed to exercise a certain amount of hours every week and stretch and do all these things. But I would argue we're a much less patient society today because some of the habits of mind we formed based on using our devices have cultivated impatience and reward impatience and give us very few moments in a day where we can't fill our interstitial time with this. So sitting at a stoplight, waiting for the bus, in the doctor's office waiting for an appointment, any single brief moment of interstitial time, you got something to do. You can play a game, you can talk to friends, you can get some work done. So in some ways, it makes us very, very productive. But it also makes it very difficult to just sit and be still and patient when we don't have access to this. And if you talk to people who work in things like you know, ICUs and hospitals or emergency rooms, they'll tell you if there's a cell phone ban, people get very impatient because we're kind of wired now to really have that distraction, and having to sit and having to just be, often in a place that's very stressful. If you're waiting to see how a loved one is doing in the hospital, that's stressful. But even in normal everyday situations like traffic, we're just much less patient. So this is why we have higher documented rates of road rage. Road rage rates are increasing every year. People are much less patient, much more aggressive on the road. Air rage, this is a new thing. I mean, when I was a kid, they still smoked on airplanes, so that was bad. But like, air rage didn't exist. But now people, when they're stuck in a space together, they do not have the tolerance for each other that previous generations might have exercised. And that, I think, is because we don't practice those skills, right? We can distract ourselves and control our attention all the time with a device. So what does that matter, right? A lot of people would argue that you know, now we don't ever have to be bored. But I would suggest there are two things. Being bored can be good for you in a number of ways. It gives your brain a break. It lets your mind wander. And we know that wandering minds actually can come up with really fascinating ideas. You study the history of science, you'll find a lot of the aha moments that many of our scientists and inventors had were when they let their mind wander. They're sitting on a bus, they're walking through a forest, and just, oh, something that had been bedeviling them was suddenly solvable because their mind just went off. This is why we talk about an aha moment in the shower, right? You're doing something routine, but your brain is allowed to kind of move. So we lose those moments throughout our day when we might be able to have a little bit of insight. I have a friend who works in the tech industry, and when he was giving me a hard time when I was working on this book, and I said, okay, well, just do this experiment for me. One day, just for one day, do not pick up your phone when you have a spare moment. And at the end of that day, see if anything feels differently. Because if it doesn't, I'm wrong and you're right. And to his credit, he told me that it was transformative for him to realize just how often he reached for that phone. And it was always for productive, important things and for, the stuff he had to do. He said, several writers who've written about this have also said this, if you carry a little notebook around and you let your mind wander, just jot stuff down. So if you're in any sort of creative field, this is actually moments where your brain gets to wander and find those aha moments. Idleness is something we now think is a negative, but idleness can be good if you can find those little idle moments and allow your mind some freedom from the constant stimulation that you get on the screen. But as a society, we also need to learn patience. I think one of the reasons we live in a very on-demand, everything should get fixed right now, just the way I want it, polarized political culture, is that we lack the patience to think through long-term solutions. A lot of the problems we need to solve require, obviously, compromise, but they also require looking ahead 5, 10, 20 years down the line and trying to think through what things will look like then. And people who are willing to do the work now and spend the money now on the programs that are necessary, even if they won't ever see the rewards that they made. And that sort of long-term thinking is on the wane too. And I live in Washington. It's obviously a very political town. But even in how people negotiate and talk about these issues, I've seen a dramatic change in just the past 10 or 20 years. A lot more impatience, a lot more simplistic solutions to things that are actually quite complicated. So as a society, impatience is bad for us. All right, number 4, how you understand your emotions. So if you consider through the prism of emotion, our technologies are very different. The new technology is very different from the old ones because of their intimacy and their persistence in your everyday life. So what do I mean by this? Your television can't take your pulse. Well, it couldn't when I was a kid. But your Kinect gaming system can track your heartbeat. A sensor embedded in your employee ID badge at a lot of places, including Bank of America and a lot of other corporate institutions, can monitor even the inflections of your voice and how many words you spoke at a meeting. Turn that into data so your manager can see if you're participating enough. If you have an Oura Ring or a smartwatch, all kinds of things can now be, all kinds of data about your physical response to things can be gathered. So I would say what the clock did to time, technologists now in Silicon Valley want to do to our emotions. They want to regulate them, regiment them, and they want to measure, monitor, and turn them into data that can be sold and used productively by that. But is this going to help us understand ourselves better? Think about it this way. Say you and your significant other, after a long day, you're home, you're sitting down, you're telling each other about your day. Say you have an Oura Ring or an Apple Watch that can measure, heart rate, galvanic skin response, blood pressure, all these things that are now possible to measure. And but we have these new platforms that allow you to read each other's emotions. So you know how you're feeling with your significant other. You can always be simpatico. Well, as your wife or husband is talking to you, you're smiling and nodding and listening and really trying to be thoughtful, but your Oura Ring is like, oh my word, you're so anxious and annoyed and really you just want to be left alone. Do we really want to know everything about each other in real time in this way? I can understand the technologists wanting to know it, but a lot of these devices are now being marketed to us to improve our relationships, stay connected, stay in tune with each other. I would argue as human beings, we actually are allowed some privacy of feeling. We need that backstage area. We need to have moments where we don't have to reveal everything about ourselves. And actually, politeness and manners exist for a reason. And it's not just to protect ourselves, it's actually to protect others. So that if someone does something embarrassing, we have a way of responding to it. And we don't have to turn everything into data. I think it also, in the de-skilling arena, it makes us less skilled at reading our own emotions. So I was interviewing a college student who spent a lot of time on social media and he was new on campus, but he'd struck up a friendship on social media with a young woman. He hadn't met her yet, but was, they had pretty intense, chats and everything. Well, then one day he bumps into her in person. And I said, well, how did that go? He's like, well, I was sweating. And I thought I was getting a fever or was going to vomit. And it was terrible. I don't know what was going on. And I, of course, immediately start laughing. And he's like, yeah, I know. It took me 10 minutes to realize I was attracted to her. he literally didn't understand the signals his body was giving him. He thought he was getting the flu. Now, he might be an extreme case. He kind of lives in his own head. But there is something to that in the way that I think the technologists would like us to mistrust our own feelings. They want to tell us, well, it's not really, unless we can quantify it, it's not real. But there's a reason we have instincts. There's a reason we have intuitions. These things cannot be turned into data. And we need to value the ones that are useful for us as human beings in our society. So when you think about the emotional experience you have online, fear, anxiety, anger, hate, these are the most powerful emotions. They're the ones that social media platforms have been designed to get you to elicit a response so that you stay on the platform. We know this. Many, many whistleblowers have gone before Congress and Parliament in the UK who worked for Facebook in particular and said, we know, we design it to get people angry, but it's not just Facebook. If you use any dating apps, nobody reads the fine print. They're constantly experimenting on their users. So OkCupid, which was a big one, early one back in the day, they programmed the site to send matches to people claiming it was an exceptional match, when in fact it was a terrible match, just to see what people would do, if they would trust OkCupid's algorithm over their own kind of, they look at the picture and go, really, exceptional? I'm a vegetarian, they hunt moose for fun. They trusted the algorithm. That was what they found out, is that people would set aside their own judgment because they had this user experience, they had data that said, oh, this is an exceptional match for me, I guess I'll go on the date. So those sorts of experiments are very powerful because they show us how we are starting to undermine our own understanding of ourselves in a way that I think could be quite dangerous. And then the final thing I'll give you on this emotional regulation, sociometric badges. Do you guys know about anyone here have a badge they have to wear? They embed a sensor in these badges, and it can track you and monitor you and do all kinds of stuff for you. There's a guy named Alex Pentland who devises all kinds of persuasive technologies. He wrote a book called Honest Signals. He was one of the early technologists who developed these sort of wearable, trackable, data hoovering sensors. And here's what he said. He says, the ability to continuously and universally measure human behavior will provide us with the ability to engineer our lives to an extent never before imagined. So he talks about how all of our urges and impulses can be turned into data, then we understand ourselves and others better. Kind of like a Freud machine, your id would always be visible in the form of data. And he says that this technology allows people to monitor the flow of information within their group, thereby transforming unconscious and tacit knowledge into open conscious information. He calls it reality mining. So the reason that scares me, might not scare everybody, the reason it scares me is that things should remain buried in unconscious sometimes. This is kind of how we were evolved to live, right? That private space in our heads. Turning all of that into data, which an algorithm that was designed to then say, well, if you're feeling this unconscious urge, it means you are this sort of person, or you might act in this sort of way. That is a very dangerous world. It's a less free world. And we know that we have this impulse to regulate and monitor and trust the algorithm already. Any of you who study criminal justice probably know about the algorithms that are used for sentencing and parole decisions. These are algorithms that are supposed to assess the risk of someone, reneging on showing up for trial and perhaps becoming a recidivist. And they're very controversial for a reason, because what they found in lots of different studies of the use of these algorithms is that judges will often rely on them far too heavily, thinking it's a more objective assessment of a human being, rather than the person who's right in front of them with all their family and loved ones trying to testify on their behalf. So I find that sort of thing in criminal justice obviously very worrisome, but we're importing that idea into our own emotional lives if we embrace a world. And by the way, that will be soon on your phone. It's not going to just be something you have to buy as an Apple Watch. All these sensors are going to be available on your phone. So we need to think about whether we want to present our emotions in that way and have them turned into data. Okay, fifth thing. This one was the most fun. The mediation of pleasure. So travel, food, sex, art, music, literature, all of the ways that humans pursue and indulge in pleasure have been dramatically changed in a very short time. The extent to which our technologies of mediation have saturated our lives and impose on our daily decision-making marks it as a new moment in human experience, but also in the way that we consume the experiences of others. We're a very vicarious society now. We can consume the experiences of others. Probably we can see more humans unboxing stuff and eating massive meals. I watched a lot of those, what's it, mukbang, the competitive eating. I watched a lot of those videos. I would not recommend. But it's fascinating. It's fascinating how much we can watch other people do things while we sit and enjoy that and do nothing. But we also are using these technologies to mediate how we find the person we want to marry, how we understand and appreciate art and music. If you go to a museum these days, I'm very lucky to live in DC. Many of our museums are free. I go to the National Gallery of Art a lot. And if you sit, which I did for an entire day in the National Gallery of Art, and watch how people look at art, it is interesting. A lot of people will walk by, take a picture, move on. Look, walk by, or they're looking at an iPad, which has like some sort of tour through the museum, or then they're looking at the art. And art historians know this, they're worried about this. There's a wonderful art professor at Harvard who makes her students go and sit and look at a painting. I think she makes them do it for a total of 8 hours, not all at once, but you have to stare at the painting and look at it over and over again for a certain amount of time before you can even try to analyze it. And what she found is that forced people to really see it. They had to sit still and look. They couldn't distract, they had to submit themselves to the vision of the artist. If you know anyone who's a musician, I know a couple comedians, they will tell you that many of them are now doing this too. You take your phone, you have to put it in a bag and set it aside when they do their set, because not just to protect their own, intellectual property, but because the experience of being a concert goer when everybody's got their phone out is very different for the audience as well as the artist than if all those phones are away. And I think the fact that we actually have to treat our phones like we have to put them in a hostage situation in order to get ourselves not to look at them tells you, again, just how quickly this shift has occurred. I would also say the things we do with our hands, the pleasures of hobbies, whether you like to build things, make things, sew, bake, we are becoming, again, more vicarious in our consumption of those things. We do a lot of looking with our eyes, not with our hands, which is what I used to tell my sons when they were toddlers, like, look with your eyes, not with your hands. But we're all doing that now, too. We're not getting out into the world and making things and doing things with our hands. Part of the reason I became a martial arts instructor as a hobby was in part because there were a lot of people who were seeking something away from technology where they had to use their physical bodies and, in the case of the martial art I train in, embarrass yourself many times because it's all about falling, getting back up, and, the learning curve is steep at the beginning and everyone looks ridiculous. But it did actually force people to slow down, think about how to use their bodies and their minds, because, you're using your mind during this time. And for a lot of people, particularly in Washington, this was a really new experience. So art, culture, anything we consume via the screen is going to have it's going to be a different qualitative experience. But there's also research about how we remember what we see. So Fairfield University did a study with patrons in a museum who took pictures of art, right? People take pictures of things thinking this will help me remember it, and I'll go back and look. But the lead researcher found out that actually the more photos you took, the less you remembered. She, in fact, called it the photo impairment effect. Because there's something about our wacky human brains that no, we're capturing it, we're externalizing that memory so we don't have to encode it here. And these studies, they've done these studies in a lot of different settings, and they've all come back with this photo impairment effect. And think about your own phone reels. How often do you go back and look at all the photos on your phone? We have millions and millions of pictures, but we're a society now that's actually has quite a poverty of memory in a lot of ways. And I think that's something that, again, in very quick time, our technology has done. I won't go into food, but the Instagram restaurant, people taking pictures of their food, all of that is a different experience. I'll give you the sixth thing and then wrap it up so we can have questions. Connection to place. So I mentioned briefly third places. We used to have a lot of these in society. Bowling alleys, clubs where people would, meet, taverns, bars, coffee shops. We still have all those places, but they're no longer serving the function of third places because they've been colonized by technology. You cannot go into most of these places without finding people generally having what I would call look-down experiences, not look-up experiences. And it's transformed public space. If you sit and look around at a public square, you'll find, so there are old films that I watched of documenting how people behave in like Bryant Park and other parts of New York. William White did a whole series of studies of public space and behavior, and everybody's smoking and reading newspapers. Those were the two things they were all doing in like the 60s. I went to the same places and watched people over the course of a couple weeks, and almost everyone's on a phone. Not everyone, but most people are engaging with technology in the public space. So that's a real shift. Does it matter? I would argue it does. I think it makes us, again, less patient, less tolerant of others. If we can always just look down at our phone, we don't have to deal with a difficult human being who's in our space. We don't have to learn to share space and to acknowledge other human beings. There's fascinating research about when people walk into an elevator, there's something you're supposed to do to signal, I am not hostile, you are not hostile, we will be in this tiny compartment together, and might get stuck, and we're all gonna be okay, and that's just this, it's a nod, an acknowledgement. We go throughout our days now in public space and we never give each other those acknowledgements. We can be on mass transit, and there have been many notorious cases where people were so buried in their phone they didn't notice. This happened on the BART. My sister lives in San Francisco. It was a huge case. A guy was walking around the train car waving a gun. Everybody's like, the video from that shows everybody like this. Nobody saw the gun. So we have become, in a weird way, sort of bystanders to our own experience, even when it's right in front of us. When fights break out, people are more likely not to intervene, not to call for help, and not to do something about the fight, but to pull out their phone and to film it, because that feels like doing something. There are entire websites, World Star and others, devoted to showing those fights. That is a shift. That is a cultural choice we've made. I would argue it's not a good one, but we don't want to have a bystander effect every time we're in public space, and I fear that's what a lot of our technologies encourage. All right, so I'll end by, I'll mention someone in Silicon Valley who I think captures everything that worries me about the future. Venture capitalist Mark Andreessen, really interesting guy, really smart guy, fascinating guy, but he likes to pronounce on the future often, and he gave a talk not that long ago where he talked about something called reality privilege. Has anyone heard of reality privilege? Probably most of you, because you're getting a college education, have reality privilege, because this is what he said. He was asked about the possibility of a future where people's inability to distinguish between reality and unreality might harm humanity. And he called this reality privilege. And here's what he said. A small percent of people live in a real-world environment that is rich, even overflowing with glorious substance, beautiful settings, plentiful stimulation, many fascinating people to talk to and work with and date. And he said, and everyone else, the vast majority of humanity, lacks this reality privilege. So their online world is, or will be, immeasurably richer, more fulfilling than most of the physical world and the social environment they have it in the quote-unquote real world. So person listening to this sort of pushed back and said, oh, that seems a little dystopian, right? Are you saying the people who don't have nice lives now should instead live their lives online? It is, in fact, if you've read Ready Player One, it is indeed that is the plot of Ready Player One, is that, you know, the rich get to live in the real world and everybody else is playing a video game. Here's what he said. He said, the reality privilege call this dystopian, he said, but reality has had 5,000 years to get good, and is clearly still woefully lacking for most people. I don't think we should wait another 5,000 years to see if it eventually closes the gap. Instead, he argued, the reality deprived should be happy to spend their time in, quote, online worlds that make life and work and love wonderful for everyone, no matter what level of reality deprivation they find themselves in the real world. So this is where I get really angry. You can see, hopefully, by my face. Defending reality is not a privilege. It is crucial to ensuring a flourishing human future. So a vision of the future, Andreessen and others' vision, where large proportions of the population are relegated to a virtual existence, is dystopian, because it means we've neglected to care for each other as human beings are required. Our duty of care to each other isn't to say, your world's terrible, so here's a fake one you can live your life out on. It is to say, your world is terrible, we need to make it better for you, and here's how we can all do this. And that's to say nothing about the physical impacts of an entire population that would just be sitting with VR goggles on their head. We won't go into that. But what I think this shows us is that there's a real desire now not to quantify the losses that have come with the incredible gains that these technologies give us. I use these things every day. I'm not a Luddite, and we can't go back. The genie is definitely out of the bottle. But what we haven't done so far, and we now have an opportunity to do, is to make a case to defend the human. And by that I mean we have to actively choose the human thing now, because it's much easier to mediate it through technology. Whether that's face-to-face communication, getting together in person with your friends without a mediating tool, whether that's learning to do something with your hands, learning some new skill that requires you have to do something with your physical body, or whether that just simply means looking up throughout the day in those brief moments of boredom or tedium, and looking up at your fellow human beings, not looking down at your phone. Because I think if we can all try to do that more, our public spaces will become less hostile, and our culture, our political culture in particular, will be a little more manageable. Technology is always supposed to extend the power of our senses. It's not supposed to replace that with sensors and algorithms that claim to be better at divining the needs and wants of our own bodies and our own minds and our own personalities. So I think what I'm making a case for ultimately is some human limits and some thoughtful limitations on some of the more transformative technological projects that people like Andreessen and others want us to embrace uncritically. This doesn't mean giving up technology or entrepreneurship or innovation by any means. It means, for lack of a better phrase, being a little more Amish. And by that I mean the Amish, they're not against technology. I mean, they're against zippers and some other things, so we don't need to go that far. But what they do before they bring a new technology into their world is they ask a whole bunch of questions about it. What's it going to do to the family? What's it going to do to our ability to work together with people outside of our community? How is it going to undermine some of the values of work and thoughtful craft that we care about? How will it change the way the world sees us and understands who we are? And they go through all of these questions for everything. So you can have a phone, but they decided not in the house. There are ways to use communication tools without having them completely take over their private world. Now, we can't all become Amish, obviously, but we can all ask those questions when we're confronted with a new technology that tries to sell us on the idea that every new thing is always better. It's not, and we should trust our human intuitions and our human experiences and the many, many, many thousands of years of human development that have shown us how to do some of these things, and to remember that we can sometimes do those better one-to-one, face-to-face, without a mediating screen between us and the world. So I will leave it at that.
You do, because your words need to be captured by the technology.
And then fed through YouTube's algorithm where it will remain forever, so think carefully before you.
I'm Ben. I'm a senior finance and accounting major, and my question is, what age should you give your kids a smartphone, and how do you weigh the factors that go into that decision?
So I would say, okay, I'll tell you what I did as a parent, and they're only now admitting that it was good. My sons were among the last students to get a cell phone. They got it in 9th grade. Now, I think it's different for boys and girls, but I would say if you can wait till high school, or as some people do, eighth grade, as long as possible would be the answer I would give. And once you do have a phone, also limit social media platform use. And that's because it's very difficult to understand the incentive structure built into these platforms and into these devices, which were designed for adults and designed to elicit responses that are similar to machine gambling in Las Vegas if you're 9 or 10. And it is impossible to teach kids that age who grew up on a diet of the screen, because it's very difficult to compete for their attention in that way. Attention is a practice, it's a habit. And if you start really, really young, habituated to on-demand instant gratification, which is what these technologies offer, it's harder to learn those as you become older. So I'm a big fan of two things with regard to cell phones and kids. I think we should have you have to be 16 years old to use a social media platform, and there is legislation right now in Congress working towards that. And I think you should have bell-to-bell no cell phones, K through 8. I think high school is a little different, meaning no cell phone use in the classrooms from the opening bell to the closing bell. Teachers want it. Students actually appreciate it. It's the parents who are the problem, because they want to monitor their kids throughout the day. but I would wait until high school if possible. And then you have to find other parents who will agree to also do the same thing, because one parent imposing that on their kid is going to make it hard for the kid, because a lot of socializing happens online. So parents often form groups and all agree, like a group of 10 or 12 parents will say, we're not going to allow the cell phones until 8th grade or until 9th grade, and they all back each other up. You do need community to enforce that boundary, I think.
Are you nervous for the future of technology, like going forward?
Yes and no. I was 10 years ago. I'm less so now as Gen Z is coming of age, because that's you all. I'm about to flatter you, and I mean it. And not just because my kids are Gen Z, actually. It's because you all have a healthy skepticism about things you're told, but you haven't let it lapse into utter cynicism or even nihilism. And when you see, I think you all watched the millennial generation make a lot of mistakes. They were really the generation this entire world experimented on with regard to technology. So I think my hope, what makes me hopeful, is that I see a lot of, two things. I see a lot of healthy skepticism about what you see on your phone, a lot of healthy awareness of, like, if I put this down for a while, or I get off Instagram for a couple weeks, which I know my son's friends did this challenge where they all got off social media for a few weeks, then you're willing to experiment and test yourself and be honest about how addicted you are to it in a way that the generations that came before never really did. So that does make me hopeful. I also am hopeful because I think Gen Z is far more entrepreneurial about ideas than millennials and definitely my generation. I hope you guys will create platforms that are healthier places for interaction, and that, I think the ideal social media platform is one that gets lots of people with a similar interest connected to each other, and then finds ways to turn that into real world action, whether that's political action, social action, or just socializing. The platforms are great for organizing people and getting them in touch, but we cannot exchange the real world interactions for that. So I'm cautiously optimistic, actually, which I wasn't 10 years ago. So.
Hi, Sandra Keating. I teach in the theology department. So as you were speaking, first of all, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. It's very, very interesting. I also have a daughter who's 22, a son who's 24, and so they went through the whole thing. Mom, everybody in my class has a cell phone. I should have one. Very difficult to resist that. A slightly different thing, though, as you were speaking, especially about the algorithms, especially at the end, it seems that this use of technology, it's so cynical about the possibility of free will. Mm-hmm. It basically says there really is no free will. I can't, in fact, the idea that somehow my internal emotions should be made public, right? It means that I don't have any control over that. I can't make a judgment about whether now is a good time for me to show that or not show that, or that I can recognize that that's an improper response to this particular situation. I'm wondering, I think I know the answer partly to this, but if you could talk a little bit about how people who are working in this technology think about free will, and whether they think there is any free will or not.
My general response is that 10, 15, almost 20 years ago now, when Facebook, now Meta, Apple, all these other companies are really starting to staff up in Silicon Valley. Yeah, they had lots of engineers, computer science people, but they also went through a certain swath of academia and hired the best behavioral scientists and psychologists and everyone who understands human motivation and risk and reward strategies, and they hired them all for extremely eye-popping salaries. I know because one of my friends was hired. And they did that because they don't like human nature, and they think it can be formed to their will, and that they believe, and this is an honest and well-intentioned assumption, I think. They think human nature has caused a lot of terrible things, war, violence, awful things. We'll fix it by nudging people in better directions, forgetting, of course, free will, and forgetting, of course, human nature, which is wonderfully creative about finding ways around any attempts to control it. You see this play out in how anyone from Silicon Valley thinks and talks about politics. So Mark Zuckerberg is a great example here. Whenever they have to come to Washington and testify before Congress or give a talk, he gave a talk at Georgetown about this, they're just so frustrated. They're like, people are so slow and dumb and stupid and irrational, and we just want to, so is politics. There should be an app for that. That is their idea. That is the opposite of what our founders, it's almost 250 years that this place has survived, which is amazing. They understood human nature. That was the first and most cardinal caution against a lot of the things that they thought went wrong in Europe. And so when they looked at human nature, it wasn't with condescension, and free will was obviously very important. Autonomy, the ability, freedom, the ability of people to think for themselves, live in a very diverse world, and still get along. Not agree, because they knew that, but not to form factions that would ever become violent, that would lead to war. Now, obviously, we did have a civil war. We've had lots of challenges. But I always contrast the founders' view of human nature with our technologists' view of human nature. Technologists are very condescending and very technocratic, and also unappreciative of what makes humanity so wonderful. And it is those quirks. It is free will, because sometimes we will choose the thing that on paper doesn't seem rational. And we will choose the thing that costs us money and time because it's the right thing to do. And it's implicated in our values. So I think there is no soul or values structure to much of what Silicon Valley does. And I don't mind that in the case of, build a better delivery app. But I do mind it when it's, how should I find a spouse? How should my children learn how to behave? Because those are the apps that actually people are inviting into their lives uncritically.
Hi, I'm Veronica. I'm a sophomore. I just had a question. How do you respond to people who have found community in the online world when the in-person physical world has been cruel to them? Are they still lacking that human in-person interaction even though they've seen cruelty?
Yes, this is an important question because there are lots of people for many reasons who can't easily navigate the physical world, whether they're disabled, whether they have any sort of, whether they live, even if you live in a very remote area, it becomes difficult. And in that sense, technology becomes this wonderful thing, a place, really. It's a space, not a place, two different things. It's a space where people can meet others who they can interact with. That is for the good. And I think there was a kind of sweet spot for a while with a lot of platforms and a lot of things. I mean, I was an early moderator in graduate school of the history listserv, which sounds very nerdy and was. But it was just a bunch of people studying certain aspects of American history, and we would all send emails and chats, and there were debates, and it was wonderful. And, as these things go, human nature, people started fighting about other things like politics and all kind, gossiping. And so as the moderator, I was constantly having to kick people off and, penalize them. And it became exhausting. There was this moment where we had these ways of connecting lots of different groups of people, and they would take that experience and move it into the real world. There was moments for political organization where that happened. The unfortunate thing now is that if you look at the data, people are spending less and less time with other people. Particularly the younger generation spends more time alone than any American generation to come before it. So we have this tool to connect, but we're not actually getting together in person. And my worry about people who've had a very bad real world experience and so retreat to the online space is that they can stay there forever. Really, I mean, you have to work, but you can even work, there are many jobs you can work remotely. And my worry is that they then never venture forth again and try. So setting aside people with physical disabilities or geographical challenges, if you're just a person who's an introvert who's had some bad social experiences, part of being a human is getting back out there and getting back up. And now you don't have to do that. You really can live in this online world. And that actually makes me sad because your friends online can't pick you up from the airport when you want to go somewhere. They can't bring you soup or help when you're sick. And we do need to know that. I mean, I did an informal survey of some kids in my neighborhood. They knew the names of more Instagram influencers than they did their own neighbors. I'm like, no, this is not that's a society whose bonds have frayed. So I would say I think those platforms can still be very useful, and in fact, quite good at helping people overcome anxieties and other things. But they can't become a substitute for human interaction and face-to-face interaction.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Johann. I'm serving as a bishop in Germany in the Lutheran Church. And, what is your perspective regarding religious experience? Christianity is incarnation. That's the top issue. I see that, for example, we are requested to stream our services. And it's going down the communal attendance. I get always complaining because in the COVID time it was streamed. Now they stopped it for many reasons. I said, why do we don't continue? I can be present in that church on Sunday, also not being present. And we discussed that. We have in favor said, okay, just online. And said, from my perspective, that's nonsense. Christianity or religion isn't practical experience of communion. But how do you see the future?
So this is an interesting question, and I originally had a chapter in the book about religious institutions, which didn't stay in for a number of reasons, mainly because actually lots of different faiths were doing lots of different things, and around COVID, I couldn't in good conscience argue that we shouldn't use these things because it was the only option. I mean, because churches were shuttered and because governments wouldn't allow them to worship. Here's what I know from the experience of watching mediation of community for several decades now. If you give people the option not to leave their home and to look at it on a screen, they'll choose that option. So once the option is presented, it's just easier. It is more convenient. And for some things, look, I went to several First Communions and a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah, a wedding. I went to all these things over COVID looking at a screen. And you know what I realize now? I've been to all those sorts of events in person too over the course of a lifetime. My memories of the ones I saw on screen are so fuzzy. And that's because, when we know this from neuroscience, we have physical event horizons and memory event horizons. One thing begins, another thing ends. I go to the wedding, and then I go home, and then I go to work. Our minds encode memory in physical space, we embody the places we are, and there's no place more important than a house of worship for that. And I think, it's funny, I'm gonna forget his name. There was a technological theorist, very pro-tech in the 60s and 70s, and he sort of half-jokingly said, well, the churches should love this. Look, priests will never have to take confession in person. We can just have an automated confession. We'll create a robot that does confession. Well, if you're a psychologist these days and you have patients with bad health insurance, they don't get to see you, the human psychologist. They get a chatbot, a therapy bot. And everyone's like, isn't this an improvement? And I'm horrified. I'm like, no, they deserve the human being. And in worship, that is very, very important. Churches are really going to have to grapple with this because there's not an easy answer because there's the reach you want to have. But I would say always, 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 coming together to worship should be a sacred space where the streaming of it really does transform the qualitative experience, not just for the people watching it, but for the people having that experience in person, because they're being watched. If you know you're being watched, your behavior changes. Just look at Congress when the C-SPAN cameras came in. Suddenly, that was like the most destructive force for democracy ever because you could have no one there and you could have a freshman House representative who wanted to get on TV at 2 in the morning, grandstanding. So it does change the way we worship if we know we're being watched. So I'm obviously not a fan of that idea, but I do think churches have to take a pretty firm stand grounded in reasoning that implicates their church tradition, because each faith is going to have a different approach to that.
I'm Arthur. I'm a sophomore. You just mentioned how, basically people's behavior changes when they're being watched, and it's kind of, I guess this is kind of something people say, but privacy is a prerequisite to freedom. And you mentioned how they're going to monitor sort of how many times you speak at a meeting to decide your performance. And then, so you have that going on, but you also have sort of the ownership of the online world and reality privilege, whatever that means. And so you have people so basically my question is in regards to, there's no privacy, the phone may know you better than anybody else, and who is doing that nudging, right? Who is deciding what we consume and what we're going to think? And I guess long term, I don't. This is I hesitate to ask like a yes or no question, but like, is this kind of like a eugenics program in the end? Like that's it's kind of hard not to see it as something like that. If there's going to be deciding someone or something deciding what we ingest and what we do, like I don't mean to go on, but that's kind of.
So we have an answer to that question. It's China today. So there you have, and I don't just mean the ubiquitous surveillance, because that they've had for some time. I mean the social credit system. Now that's government controlled, and it does bar you from just about housing, where you can shop, what forms of transportation you're eligible for, kinds of jobs you're eligible for, and it grows and grows and grows with each passing year. In the West, I think we have a conceit, which is that, well, we would never do that. We care about freedom. We care about democracy. Except that we are doing a slightly more consumer-oriented version of that. And actually, where it does track to eugenics is that we practice eugenics. It's just consumer-based eugenics. So it's privatized. The government's not telling people what kind of babies to have, but people are going to clinics that are entirely unregulated and choosing the sex of their child and choosing all kinds of other things, too. That's eugenics. But it's because people are making the individual choice, we argue that that should be allowed. I mean, I don't argue that, but that is the argument. So I think when it comes to surveillance, we have, in a way, a kind of 20th century version of it. It's like the government monitoring us. This is bad. We don't want that. Yes. The problem is now that's not how surveillance is done for most of our days. It's something, there was a theorist who called it sousveillance, S-O-U-S. We all monitor each other all the time. And what that does is create a kind of social credit system for each other. And you see this on Instagram and these social media platforms in its extreme form. Because there, people judge and social ranking and all the different clues that everyone has to give in terms of where they fit status-wise that can have really deeply serious real-world repercussions. And not just for teenagers, but for adults. I mean, how many stories have you read where someone blew up their life because of something they posted on Twitter, now X? It happens all the time. So in a way, I would say we are still very reliant on this idea of privacy and freedom and the rights that we are deeply lucky to have. And we need to start shifting our thinking to understanding that these platforms, and this is a big debate in the democracy space, as they say, can you actually have free and fair elections in a society where AI will be able to spoon feed people all kinds of, not just untruthful things, but slightly untrue, or to moderate, say that therapy chatbot I told you about, it sells some of your information to a political campaign, which then injects, not an ad exactly, but just like different ways of thinking through questions that are more amenable to one political party over the other. What if, and you can already do this, a slightly less charismatic politician can use AI in real time to basically filter their faces in live, anytime they're live, so that they look more pleasing or whatnot. All of this is possible. So is that a free society? And who's accountable if something goes wrong? And this is where the algorithm and social media examples should give us a lot of caution going forward with use of AI, particularly in educational spaces, in workplaces, anything to do with war or anything to do with criminal justice, in my opinion. Because having a human in the loop isn't going to be good enough. If you talk to people, as I have, who have used some of these early AI efforts at the Pentagon, they do these war games. The AI, which is still not a generative intelligence, it's just, it's a programmed AI, it will figure out how to get that human out of the loop very quickly, usually by cutting their communications line so that the AI can finish the mission. A mission that the human's supposed to say, no, wait, don't, that was a school, not a military base. So there are huge, huge ethical and moral challenges ahead, and we need to learn the lessons now of our mistakes when it came to algorithmically decided crucial human freedoms. The tech companies have zero interest in any sort of transparency. They still will not release their data to outside researchers. I mean, there's all kinds of things there's pressure that can be brought to bear on the tech companies themselves. But if you're an employee, say your first job when you graduate is for a big bank, and they're like, here's your employee ID badge. And you say, and here's your insurance card. Now, you'll get $50 credit if you allow us to track the number of steps you take, and if you allow us to monitor if you smoke. That now happens to lots of employees. What are you going to do? You need the job. You're going to say, okay, because you don't really have a choice, right? I mean, you can try to find another company that doesn't do that. But as these things become more ubiquitous and more profitable and useful for companies, it'll be harder to say no. Try to be a long-haul trucker who's not going to have his brain, doesn't have to wear the hat. You guys know about the hat with sensors to prevent, so they can, it's reading in real time all kinds of signals to make sure they don't fall asleep at the wheel. It's for safety. But some of these truckers are now starting to sue because it's also an invasion of their privacy, some of the stuff that can be read from this data. So yeah, fun times ahead. But you're right to be concerned about all of that.
Got time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Noah Ashby. I'm a neuroscience major here at Providence. You've talked and written a lot about how technology kind of eliminates the experience of waiting and how it kind of takes away the virtue of patience. And I was just wondering if you think that that problem is more due to the possibilities that technology give us, like just scrolling mindlessly, or is it the way in which our culture has taught us to use technology?
I would say it's both, but above and beyond even those two things, it's a mindset that our culture has embraced to an extreme, which is that every moment should be productive in some way. Even your leisure time should be productive. You should count your steps, do that. So there's a way in which I think the technology exacerbates a problem that's actually got deeper roots. I mean, really spiritual roots. Like we have, there is a kind of poverty of experience where we're filling time with the easy choice because figuring out the harder thing to do and putting the time and effort into it is actually becoming increasingly difficult for lots of people. And I'm not talking about like spending money on an expensive hobby or anything. I mean, when you have a moment of time, your impatience with boredom is the end result of many, many cumulative years of assuming you should never be bored. Does that make sense? If you look at kids, so I have a story in the book about going to Disney with my kids. I grew up in Florida and I'd go to Disney all the time. And I was astonished at the transformation. Like nobody is expected to just wait. You have to be entertained all the time, and it's constant. And we've turned our entire society into a line at Disney, where the expectation is that people shouldn't have to cultivate those habits. I think that's where we need to push back and say, and I think it's why people are seeking more things like a more strict spiritual practice. Meditation is booming. Of course, everyone wants you to buy an app to meditate, which is ironic. But they're all, I think that's actually people seeking the discipline of mind, new habits, new routines that will help them say no to the easy thing. Because when you have a free moment, people aren't doing useful things, right? You go down the rabbit hole. How many TikTok videos until you're like, what time is it? I mean, get TikTok off your phones, by the way. Please don't use TikTok. But this is actually a deeper challenge than just the technology, if that makes sense. We have to start inculcating those virtues very young and practicing them in different ways and choosing the sometimes harder path, not the seamless, not the efficient. And also, you do not have to be productive every minute of every day. It's very harmful to your development and your sense of self as a human being to think that if you're just sitting around looking at a painting, you're not doing something useful.
Please join us down the hall for the reception, and please give Dr. Rosen a warm round of applause.